I've never been the type to bottle things up. When something bothers me, I usually say it right away. But that night, after a heated argument with my brother, I just stormed out of the house. It was one of those silly fights that start over nothing and escalate into a shouting match. I needed to clear my head, you know? I grabbed my car keys and started driving aimlessly, just wanting to be alone for a while. After about 20 minutes, I decided to pull into the local park. It wasn't a place I'd normally visit at night, but at that moment, it seemed quiet. The kind of quiet I needed. When I got there, the parking lot was almost empty. Just one or two cars scattered around, but no one in sight. The park's lighting was dim, with those spaced-out street lamps casting a yellowish glow over the main paths. I sat in my car for a while, trying to collect my thoughts. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the faint creak of a broken swing from the playground. Despite the eerie atmosphere, the place was oddly calming. It felt like I was in another world, far away from the chaos at home. After some time, the cold started to creep in, and I decided to turn on the car to warm up. But to my surprise, nothing happened. I turned the key again and again, but it was dead silent. The dashboard flickered like it was mocking me, and the engine didn't even try to start. It had to be the battery. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone to call for roadside assistance, but the signal was terrible. After a few tries, I finally got through, and they said it would take at least 2 hours for someone to get there. With nothing else to do but wait, I started paying more attention to my surroundings. That's when I saw it. Near one of the street lamps, in the farthest corner of the parking lot, there was a figure. It was hard to tell if it was a man or a woman, but the silhouette was unmistakable. They were just standing there, completely still, as if frozen. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just someone out for a walk or waiting for a ride. But as the minutes passed, an uneasy feeling began to grow. Something about their rigid posture, their total lack of movement, felt wrong. I tried convincing myself it was just paranoia, that I was tired and letting my imagination run wild. After all, a family fight, a dead car, and an empty park, it was the perfect recipe for feeling on edge. But I couldn't stop glancing at the figure. They stood under the street lamp, well lit by the yellow light, yet it was hard to make out any details. They seemed to be wearing a heavy coat, maybe a trench coat, and there was something unsettling about their stance. Worse, I couldn't shake the constant feeling of being watched, even from that distance. To test my nerves, and maybe calm them down, I decided to flash my car's headlights, just to see if they'd react. I turned them on and off a few times, expecting some kind of movement, but nothing happened. The figure stayed completely still, as if they hadn't even noticed. That should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. My mind started conjuring all sorts of bizarre scenarios. What if they were waiting for me? Or worse, what if they weren't even human? Those thoughts spun around in my head, making me more and more uneasy. After about 20 minutes, unease turned into near panic. I picked up my phone to distract myself, but the signal was still weak and my battery was draining fast. I started scrolling aimlessly through old photos just to keep myself busy, but every time I looked up, the figure was still there. Then I noticed something even more bizarre. The street lamp's light didn't seem to cast their shadow properly. It was like the light didn't behave the way it should around them, almost as if they weren't entirely there. My heart started pounding, and I realized I needed to leave. Even with the car out of commission, I figured I could walk to the park entrance, where there might be more people, or maybe a security guard. I grabbed my jacket, opened the car door, and the moment I stepped outside, the air changed. You know that feeling when everything gets quieter than it should be? It wasn't just the wind stopping, it was everything. The silence was so profound, it felt like I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my chest. I froze for a few seconds, staring in the direction of the figure. It was still there, motionless, but now it seemed larger. I can't exactly explain why, but the silhouette felt more imposing, more present. My instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, lock the doors, and wait for help, but something about the stillness kept me rooted in place. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the very environment was trying to push me back into the car. Even so, I took a deep breath and started walking toward the park entrance. Every step felt harder than the last. I forced myself not to look back, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My back prickled with unease, as if that thing's gaze was burning into me. I thought I'd hear footsteps following me, but there was nothing. The silence was absolute. When I finally worked up the nerve to glance over my shoulder, I wished I hadn't. The figure was much closer now. There hadn't been any sound, no movement that I could see, but it was easily halfway between where it had been and where I was. I swallowed hard, my breathing quickened, and my legs started to tremble. I wanted to run, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I kept walking slowly, trying to stay calm, though my mind was racing. Who or what was that? Why wasn't it making any noise, even when it moved so quickly? It felt like the space around that figure didn't follow the rules I understood, like it existed outside normal logic. Finally, I reached a bench near the park's entrance and sat down, more to buy time and think than out of exhaustion. I pulled out my phone again and tried to call someone, anyone, but the signal was still dead. I looked around, hoping to see another car, a security guard, anything, but I was completely alone. When I glanced back at the path I'd come from, my stomach dropped. The figure was gone. It wasn't under the street lamp or anywhere along the path. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Not knowing where it was made it even worse. My first instinct was to get up and keep walking, but my legs felt like lead. I sat there frozen, trying to steady my breathing, but it was impossible to ignore the overwhelming sense that something was very wrong. The absence of that figure only made my mind race with worse possibilities. Was it hiding? Watching me from somewhere I couldn't see? I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was just a regular person, but nothing about this situation made sense. No one stands still like that for so long, and no one disappears without a sound. As my mind spiraled, something caught my eye in my peripheral vision, a shadow, moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, near the closest trees. I turned my head instinctively, but there was nothing there. It was like I'd imagined it, but the feeling lingered. A wave of panic washed over me, that primal certainty that I wasn't alone. I decided I had to do something. Sitting there wasn't an option. I stood up, unsteady, and started walking again toward the park's main gate. Each step felt heavier than the last. The silence was oppressive, and the air felt denser, like I was wading through water. When I finally spotted the gate in the distance, a flicker of relief ran through me. But just then, I heard it, a sound behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. It was the sound of feet dragging along the ground, slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold, and every fiber of my being screamed at me not to look back. But of course I did. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the path, motionless again. This time, the light from the nearest street lamp partially illuminated its face. Only, it wasn't a face. It was something warped, like a mask made of melted wax, with no eyes or mouth, just dark, sunken voids where features should have been. My stomach churned, and my vision blurred. It didn't move, but the feeling that it was watching me was suffocating. At that moment, I knew my only chance was to run. Without thinking twice, I turned and sprinted toward the gate. I ran like I'd never run before, the adrenaline surging through me and propelling me forward. The gate seemed so close, yet it felt like I wasn't getting any closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else. What terrified me most was the complete absence of sound behind me. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. It was as if that thing wasn't following me physically, but in some other, more sinister way. Every part of me screamed to keep running, to not stop, not look back. When I finally reached the gate, I stopped for a second to try and push it open, but it was locked. A massive padlock secured the metal bars as if someone had closed the park without me noticing. My desperation spiked. I started shaking the gate, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frantically, I looked around for another way out, but the park was surrounded by a tall wall, far too high for me to climb. That's when I heard the sound again, behind me. The slow, dragging footsteps, closer this time. I turned around and there it was, the figure, just a few yards away. It wasn't under a street lamp this time, but I could see it clearly enough. This time, it was holding something in its hands, a long object, maybe a piece of wood or metal, but it was hard to tell in the dim light. The oppressive feeling of being watched was now unbearable. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I shouted something, I don't even remember what, but it didn't react. It didn't move, it just stood there like a distorted, faceless statue. That's when I remembered my car. It was my only chance. If I could make it back and lock myself inside, I might have a shot at waiting out the night until help arrived. It wasn't a great plan, but it was the only one I had. I took a deep breath, mustered every ounce of courage I had left, and started running again. This time, I didn't dare look back. The dragging footsteps continued, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. My mind was on the verge of breaking. When I reached my car, I was out of breath and on the verge of collapse. My hands were shaking so much, it took me a few tries to get the door open. I got inside and locked the doors immediately, slamming my back against the seat as if that could protect me. I grabbed my phone, and with the last bit of battery left, I tried calling roadside assistance again. This time, the call connected almost instantly. I frantically explained where I was, begging them to hurry. The person on the other end reassured me they were on their way, but it would take another 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The atmosphere in the car was suffocating. The windows fogged up from my heavy breathing, but I didn't dare wipe them. I didn't want to see outside. Still, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was there, standing just behind my car. It was closer than ever, illuminated faintly by the same lone street lamp. This time, it tilted its head slightly, as if curious, almost playful. My chest tightened with fear, and all I could do was wait. The next few minutes felt like the longest of my life. I kept my eyes glued to the mirror, barely blinking, as if that would keep it from moving. Then I heard it, the sound of an engine approaching in the distance. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. The headlights of the roadside assistance truck swept across the parking lot, illuminating everything. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I glanced back at the mirror, but the figure was gone. No trace of it. It was as if it had never been there. When the technician arrived, I practically jumped out of the car, babbling about what had happened. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You must be exhausted," he said as he checked the battery. I didn't argue. Once the car was running again, I drove straight home, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in that park. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something I can't explain. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back there, and I'd strongly advise anyone else to stay away. I've never been the type of person who enjoys driving at night, but that week I didn't have much of a choice. My job had sent me on a last-minute trip to a small town 5 hours away, and I was driving back home after a long day. The clock on the dashboard read 10:47 p.m., and the silence on the road was so absolute I could hear the hum of the engine echoing inside the car. The highway was completely deserted, just the dark asphalt ahead of me and the faint glow of my headlights lighting up the faded road signs. It was a cold November night, and the air inside the car felt heavier than usual. That's when I noticed the car for the first time. It appeared in my rearview mirror as a pair of glaring headlights getting closer and closer. So close for a moment. I thought it might be someone I knew playing a prank, but I quickly dismissed the idea. Who else would be on this road at this hour? At first, I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe it was someone in a rush, but the car didn't pass. It stayed glued to my bumper, its headlights nearly blinding me through the mirror. The tension started building, but I tried to convince myself it was just some reckless driver. After a good 2 or 3 minutes, I turned on my signal and switched to the right lane, hoping the car would overtake me. But as soon as I did, it sped up, passed me on the left, and swerved sharply into my lane. The move was so sudden I almost lost control of the wheel. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. For a few seconds, the car in front of me just slowed down, crawling so slowly it seemed like it was trying to force me to stop. What the hell is this guy doing? I thought, anger mixing with a tinge of fear. I tried moving to the other lane, but as soon as I did, it sped up and blocked my path again. This wasn't a coincidence, that much was clear. Whoever was driving was messing with me, but this wasn't a game I wanted to play. Sweat was running down the back of my neck, even with the heater turned off. Every time I tried to maneuver around the car or create some distance, the driver seemed to anticipate my moves. It wasn't just annoying, it was terrifying. The road remained empty, no other cars in sight, no lights besides the headlights. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, trapped in this twisted game. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, and my hands started to ache from gripping the wheel too hard. I decided to try a different approach. I slowed down almost to a stop, hoping the car would just go ahead and leave me alone. For a moment, it worked. The car kept going, and eventually, its taillights disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to collect myself, the silence of the night almost as oppressive as the driver had been. Maybe they gave up, I thought, clinging to a shred of optimism that would soon be crushed. As soon as I started driving again, there it was. I don't know how or where it came from, but it was back behind me, even more aggressive this time. Now it began flashing its headlights in rapid, irritating bursts that set my nerves on edge. I tried to remember everything I'd ever heard about situations like this. Don't react, don't engage, just keep driving. But it was impossible to ignore. My entire body was on high alert, as if it knew something very wrong was about to happen. Suddenly, the car sped up again, passing me on the right. But instead of continuing forward, it swerved sharply in front of me, forcing me onto the shoulder. My car shook violently, and I barely managed to stay on the road. The scream that escaped my throat felt more like an instinct than a conscious sound. Finally, the car stopped, and I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. After a few seconds trying to catch my breath, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the car disappear into the night. But it didn't. It stopped a few meters ahead, parked in the middle of the road, as if waiting for me. Its headlights were still on, glaring like two hungry eyes watching me. For a moment, I thought about turning around and driving back the other way, but that would mean losing even more time on this desolate highway. Besides, they might just follow me again. I decided to move forward. I restarted the engine, tightened my seatbelt, and began driving slowly, my eyes locked on the car ahead. As I got closer, it started moving too, keeping a deliberate, taunting distance. The tension was unbearable. I didn't know if this was some kind of insane prank or something much worse. I started paying closer attention to the car. It was an old black sedan, probably from the late 90s, with a dull paint job and a cracked rear taillight. A common car, yet it felt like it had rolled straight out of a nightmare. While I tried to plan my next move, the sedan suddenly accelerated, gaining incredible speed and vanishing once again into the darkness. I sighed in relief, but still couldn't shake the unease. The road felt longer and more isolated than ever. My mind raced, trying to make sense of why someone would do this. Was it pure malice, or did they have some specific reason? Maybe they mistook me for someone else, but whatever the reason, I just wanted this to end. Then I saw it again. The red taillights, stopped in the middle of the road ahead. My heart started racing. There was no way around it now. I had to pass by it to keep going. I slowed down as I approached, desperately trying to think of something that might protect me, but there was nothing. Just the crushing silence of the road, the hum of my engine, and that unbearable sense that something was horribly, horribly wrong. I've never been the type to pick up strangers on the road. I've always had this better safe than sorry mindset, especially after hearing so many bizarre stories. But that night, something in me faltered. It was a regular Tuesday, and I was driving home late after working a long shift. The road cut through a rural area, and the night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel completely isolated, with only the sound of the tires on the asphalt to keep you grounded. My car, an old but reliable sedan, had a full tank of gas, and all I wanted was to get home. It was past midnight, and the highway was as empty as ever. That's when I saw him. From a distance, my headlights illuminated a man standing by the roadside, waving his arms like he was in a panic. His movements were frantic and erratic. He was wearing a worn-out leather jacket, faded jeans, and had a short, scruffy beard. He looked like someone who'd been on the road for days. Instinctively, I slowed down, but my brain immediately screamed, "Don't stop! This isn't safe!" But the way he looked at my car, with wide, desperate eyes, made me hesitate. He seemed terrified, like he was running from something. Against all my better instincts, I pulled over. I rolled the window down just enough to hear what he had to say. He sounded breathless, his voice shaky as he explained that his car had broken down a few miles back and that he needed help. "Please, someone's been following me for hours," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. Something about his voice sounded genuine, but there was a layer of desperation that made me uneasy. I asked him why he hadn't called the police, and he shook his head frantically. "I tried, but there's no signal out here. Please, just get me out of here," he pleaded. My heart was racing, but for some reason, I unlocked the door and let him in. As soon as he got in, the car was filled with a strange smell, a mix of sweat and something metallic, almost like blood. He seemed restless, constantly checking the rearview mirror and shifting in his seat. My mind raced with doubts. What if he was lying? What if he was dangerous? But then I thought, if I were in his position, wouldn't I want someone to help me? I started driving again, but that's when things began to feel even stranger. He started asking me questions, where I lived, where I was headed, and his tone had shifted. The panic was gone, replaced with something calmer, but not in a reassuring way. It felt calculated. As I drove, I tried to hide my discomfort. My eyes darted between the road and the rearview mirror, where I could see part of his face lit by the glow of the dashboard. He seemed to relax more with every mile, but that didn't make me feel any better. I casually asked where he wanted me to drop him off, trying to sound nonchalant, but his response made my blood run cold. "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." His tone was firm, almost like an order. My instincts screamed again, but what could I do at that moment? We were in the middle of nowhere, and running wasn't exactly an option. A few minutes later, he started talking about the person who had supposedly been following him. He said it was a black car with its headlights off, appearing and disappearing out of nowhere. The way he described it was so detailed that, for a moment, I thought he might be making it up. But then he mentioned something that made my skin crawl. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw someone sitting in the back seat of my car. He let out a short, nervous laugh, like it was a bad joke, but he didn't seem to be joking. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to glance at my back seat just to make sure it was empty. It was, but the uneasiness only grew. Then he did something even stranger. He pulled something out of his pocket. It looked like a keychain, but there was something attached to it that I couldn't quite make out. He started twirling it around his fingers, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked suddenly, his calmness sending chills down my spine. I laughed nervously and said I hadn't really thought about it. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes locking onto mine for a second that felt far too long. "I believe some people are destined to cross our paths, no matter what," he said in a near whisper. My heart raced, and I started thinking of ways to get out of this situation. Then, as if things weren't unsettling enough, he pointed at something on the side of the road and told me to stop. It was an empty stretch surrounded by dense, dark trees that seemed to swallow any light that touched them. I hesitated, and he noticed. "What are you afraid of?" he asked, with a smile that didn't match the desperation he had shown earlier. Something was very wrong. I swallowed hard and tried to deflect, saying it might be better to take him straight to the nearest town. But he insisted, this time with a colder tone. I said, "Stop the car." My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I knew stopping there was a terrible idea, but I couldn't think of a convincing excuse that wouldn't make him angry. The road seemed endless and desolate, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Against my will, I slowly pulled the car over to the shoulder. He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, staring into the darkness outside. The silence was so heavy that the sound of the engine felt deafening. "This won't take long," he finally said, still fiddling with the keychain in his hand. He opened the door and stepped out, but he didn't go in the direction I expected. Instead of heading toward the road or some specific spot, he started walking into the dense forest. The headlights lit up only a few feet ahead, and beyond that, it was pitch black. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Part of me wanted to hit the gas and leave, but what if he ran back to the car? What if he had already thought of that? Then something caught my eye. On the seat where he had been sitting, there was something small and shiny. I reached over and picked it up. It was a twisted piece of metal, like a fragment of something larger. It didn't make sense, but it felt significant. As I tried to figure out what it was, I realized he was taking too long. I looked in the rearview mirror and then out the window, but I couldn't see him anywhere. That's when I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest, the crickets, the rustling leaves, had gone completely silent. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The silence was so absolute that I could almost hear my own blood pumping. Suddenly, I heard fast footsteps coming toward the car. My body froze, and all I could think was, "This is it. He's going to do something." When the passenger door was yanked open, I screamed, but it wasn't him. It was another man, older, with a pale face and wide, terrified eyes, like he had just escaped from something awful. "Get out of here now!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. Before I could react, he opened my driver's side door and tried to pull me out. "You don't understand. He's not who you think he is. If you stay here, you're going to die." My brain went into total panic mode. I didn't know who to trust or what to do. Then I saw, for the first time, something moving among the trees. It wasn't human. My eyes locked onto the darkness between the trees, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It was a tall silhouette, moving strangely, almost as if it were gliding between the trunks. The older man kept trying to pull me out of the car, but my body was frozen. "Move! Now! He's bringing it for you!" he yelled, his urgency snapping me out of my paralysis. I released the parking brake and slammed on the gas, leaving the man and that figure behind. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but something inside me whispered that I still wasn't safe. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing in the middle of the road, frantically waving his arms, just like the first man had. Behind him, the figure seemed to grow, as if feeding on the darkness around it. For a brief moment, I thought I saw eyes glowing, locked onto my car. Tears streamed uncontrollably down my face, and all I could think about was getting away. But the road felt endless, and every shadow on the asphalt seemed to take on a life of its own. Then, it hit me. Not physically, but an idea. I still had that piece of metal the younger man had left on the seat. With trembling hands, I picked it up and examined it more closely. There were symbols etched into it, almost like markings that I didn't recognize. Without thinking too much, I rolled down the window and threw it out, as if breaking some sort of connection that was keeping me trapped in this nightmare. Instantly, the air around me seemed to change, and the suffocating pressure that had enveloped me began to lift. I don't know if it was a coincidence or something more, but the headlights behind me disappeared. Finally, I saw the lights of a small town in the distance and felt my body begin to relax, if only slightly. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and took a deep breath for the first time in hours. When I glanced at the passenger seat, I noticed something burned into the upholstery, like it had been seared there. "You can't escape." My stomach dropped. I stepped out of the car and approached the gas station attendant, but before I could say anything, he looked at me like he already knew. "You saw him, didn't you?" He shook his head slowly and added, "You're lucky you got away. Not everyone does." To this day, I don't know exactly what happened that night or who or what that man really was. I've never driven that road again, and just thinking about it sends chills through my body. Sometimes I dream of that figure in the trees, growing and coming closer, and I wake up with the feeling that I'm still being watched. But what haunts me most is the thought that the piece of metal is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. It was late, and Lisa and I were driving back from a weekend trip to visit some old friends in the countryside. One of those nights where everything seems to go wrong. The GPS stopped working, our phones had no signal, and the dark, narrow roads seemed to stretch endlessly, splitting into turns that led nowhere. I was behind the wheel, trying to stay calm, but frustration was eating at me. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, clutching her phone to her chest, as if that would somehow make the signal come back. There wasn't a single car or house in sight, just us, the road, and an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing mile. After nearly half an hour of aimless driving, we spotted a faint light in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from our headlights on a road sign, but as we got closer, it became clear it was a house. An old, weathered farmhouse sitting in the middle of an overgrown field. Lisa's face lit up with hope, suggesting we stop and ask for directions. I wasn't so sure, but I pulled up near the entrance anyway. Something about the house gave me an uneasy feeling. The windows were wide open, creaking slightly in the wind, and the wooden exterior looked like it hadn't been cared for in decades. We stepped out of the car and made our way to the front door. The sound of our boots crunching on the gravel seemed to echo unnaturally, and the air carried a strange mix of damp earth and something metallic, almost like rust. I knocked twice, the sound reverberating through the stillness, but there was no response, no movement. Lisa glanced at me, her face a mix of impatience and nervousness, and I suggested we head back to the car. As we turned to leave, something caught the corner of my eye, a faint flicker of light inside the house. Lisa noticed it too. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. As we walked back to the car, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. There was no wind, yet I could swear I heard faint footsteps in the tall grass nearby. Lisa suddenly turned her head, looking over her shoulder, and I followed suit, but there was nothing there. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, trying to sound confident, but my voice cracked slightly. No response. We quickened our pace, and Lisa grabbed my hand tightly. The car was only a few feet away when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. It was impossible. The house had looked completely abandoned just moments ago. Lisa and I exchanged a quick glance but didn't say a word. We just sped up, heading straight for the car. I unlocked the doors and practically shoved Lisa inside before jumping into the driver's seat. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the key in the ignition. The engine hesitated, as if mocking us in the worst possible moment. Just then, I felt it. That inexplicable sensation of something standing behind me, close enough to hear faint, uneven breathing. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas, kicking up gravel as we sped away. But we didn't get far. The road that had seemed so straightforward earlier now felt like it was shifting. The curves were tighter, the overhanging trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the car. Lisa clutched the dashboard, glancing nervously out the back window as if expecting to see something chasing us. "The lights," she muttered suddenly, pointing back toward the house, which was barely visible in the distance now. The lights were flickering wildly, almost like a strobe. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw shadows moving erratically inside the house. Not normal shadows. They were unnaturally long and distorted, defying any sense of logic. Even as we drove, the feeling of being pursued wouldn't leave us. Lisa let out a sharp gasp, pointing toward the rearview mirror. I looked briefly and nearly lost control of the car. Something was behind us. It was hard to describe, but it wasn't human. The shapes looked vaguely humanoid, but twisted in impossible ways, like figures ripped straight out of a nightmare. Their movements were erratic, as if they were skipping through space rather than running. Whatever they were gaining on us. Lisa began sobbing, her voice breaking with panic. "It won't stop! It's not going to stop!" I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the car fought me, as if something invisible was pulling us back. The air inside the car grew heavy, like it was being drained of oxygen, and my vision blurred. I knew we had to act fast, or this would end badly. In desperation, I veered the car sharply onto a narrow dirt trail branching off the main road. Lisa screamed, clutching the seat, but I didn't stop. The trail was rough and full of potholes, but it was our only chance to shake off whatever was following us. The trail felt endless, and the tall grass on both sides seemed to swallow us, making the headlights nearly useless. Lisa started praying softly, something I had never seen her do before. I kept my focus on the road, but with every turn, my stomach sank deeper. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening bang shattered the tension. The car shook violently. One of the rear tires had blown out. The car skidded, nearly veering off the trail, and I had to fight the wheel to keep us from crashing. When we finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as whatever we were running from. "We need to get out of here," Lisa screamed, her voice trembling but resolute. I knew she was right, but stepping out of the car meant facing whatever was out there. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and got out, even as Lisa begged me not to. The sound of rustling in the grass around us was constant now, and my stomach churned with every step I took toward the flat tire. As I illuminated the ground, my heart stopped. There weren't just footprints near the car, there were deep grooves, like claw marks, gouged into the dirt and gravel. They circled the car in erratic patterns, coming and going as if something had been watching us for a long time. Suddenly, a piercing screech tore through the stillness, somewhere between a human scream and the cry of a wounded animal. I ran back to the car without looking back. Lisa had already slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel. "We can't stay here," she cried, and I knew she was right. Without another word, we decided to drive on, even with the car lurching and rattling from the blown tire. The trail began to slope downward slightly, and the trees thinned out, revealing an open field in the distance. For the first time, we felt a sliver of hope that we might escape. But as we got closer to the field, we saw it. The house. The same house we had just left behind on the main road, now standing ominously at the end of the trail. Lisa started to sob, whispering, "This can't be happening. This can't be happening," while I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The farmhouse looked different now. The lights that had been flickering were gone, and the door was wide open, as if it had been waiting for us. There was no logical explanation. We had been driving straight, yet somehow we were back at the same place. The house seemed different now. The flickering lights were gone, but the front door stood wide open, as if beckoning us inside. Lisa buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed, And I knew we couldn't just stay in the car. As much as I didn't want to, something told me we had to confront whatever this was. We stepped out together, our steps hesitant on the gravel, until we reached the entrance. The air around the house felt colder, and the smell of damp earth and decay was suffocating. Crossing the threshold, the creaking wooden floorboards under our feet sent my heart racing. The silence inside was deafening, making every step sound like an explosion. The interior was a wreck, broken furniture, mold-covered walls, and an overwhelming stench of rot that turned my stomach. Lisa clung to my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. We started up the stairs leading to the second floor, but a low, guttural noise stopped us in our tracks. It came from a hallway to our right. Lisa tugged at my arm, urging me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the sound. At the end of the hallway, something was watching us. It wasn't human. I was certain of that. Its form was indistinct, like a dense shadow that seemed to defy gravity as it floated and shifted. Two bright, glowing points, like eyes, pierced through the darkness, locked onto us. Suddenly, it lunged forward, impossibly fast, a blur of unnatural movement. Lisa screamed, her voice piercing and raw, and I barely managed to react. Grabbing her hand, I bolted toward the car, every instinct in my body screaming to escape. Once inside, I twisted the key so hard I almost broke it, but the engine roared to life. I hit the gas with everything I had, ignoring the blown tire and the car's violent shaking. I didn't dare look back. Lisa sat frozen in shock, staring blankly ahead. We didn't stop driving until we reached a busy highway, the glow of other cars' headlights finally giving us a fleeting sense of safety. We never spoke about it to anyone. To this day, I don't know what we saw in that house or how it seemed to trap us. But one thing is certain. No matter how lost you are, never go into a place that feels like it's waiting for you.